Hello and welcome to Fine is a four-letter word. My guest today is my new friend, Craig Andrews. Welcome to the show, Craig.
Lori, it's so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Craig and I met through LinkedIn, I think it was, maybe. And I was a guest on Craig's podcast. And then we got to talking and he was sharing some of his story. And I was like, yeah, you need to come on my show. So here we are, ready to go. I like to start out asking the question, because I'm just curious how people grew up and what the values and beliefs that were instilled in them were. And I know, like, I ask this question and people are like, well, nothing was said explicitly. No, that's not how we learn. It was what was implied. What did you learn growing up in the family you grew up in?
Well, I grew up on the other side of the Chesapeake Bay from you on the Eastern Shore. And
Yeah, I can't hear that in the accent at all.
believe it or not, it's greatly tempered after living in Texas for 20 years. But the Eastern Shore, there's a few ruffians over there, and a lot for us. It was basically go sort yourself out. And so when I was 6 and my brother was 10, we were headed into the woods with sharp objects, axes and saws, unsupervised. And literally at that age, my brother and I were building a log cabin in the woods. And we would come home at the end of the day and my parents would say, all right, so what'd y'all do? And, we'd tell them some bit of it. One day, one of those stories was that we found a new swimming hole. And my dad said, well, tell me about the swimming hole, because, there's sea nettles or jellyfish on the Chesapeake Bay, and those are no fun. And so we found one that was absolutely free of sea nettles. And he was like, well, tell me about it. And we started describing it. And he said, okay, you were swimming in a sewage pond. And
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And so that was, we just kind of self-managed and self-sorted ourselves out.
Yes, because that's what we did back when we were growing up. Our generation, nobody was helicoptering.
No. And I mean, I look at it now, I mean, it seemed perfectly normal then, but I was like, okay, I was 6, my brother was 10, and we were headed into the woods alone with sharp objects.
Right. Yeah. It's all good. It's fine.
I still have all my fingers.
Yes. Right. So a sense of freedom, I would imagine, was, one of the values instilled in you, and like you can do it on your own.
Yeah, and it's, it horrifies my wife when we talk about this. She says I was raised by wolves, but it served me well in life. I mean, I have walked across 2 major world cities in the middle of the night without a map before they had smartphones. And one was Berlin, and the other was Tokyo. And just for different reasons, I was literally on the other side of the city, and I had to get back to where I was staying. In Berlin, it was a youth hostel, and in Tokyo, it was a hotel. And I dead reckoned my way back to where I was going in the middle of the night with no map. And again, we didn't have smartphones. There was no Google Maps at the time. There was no Google at the time. And so just having that spirit of, working things out, it's served me well, and probably at least partially responsible for me being alive today.
Yeah. Well, there's another, before we get into your story too much, there's another aspect of that story that I think contributes to your being alive. And that was that you joined the Marines, right?
Yeah. Joined the Marines. I was nobody ever accused me of being an exceptional student in high school. And so at some point I realized that my 2.54 GPA would not get me into any university that anybody had ever heard of. And it wasn't that I couldn't earn higher. It was just, I didn't care. And so I thought, I need to do something different. And I met my first great salesperson in my life, my Marine recruiter. I went in to sign up for 3 years. He got me signed up for 6.
Okay. Was anyone else in your family in armed services?
My dad was. My dad was on a ROTC scholarship at Johns Hopkins during the Korean War. And he screwed around in college. almost lost his scholarship. And if it weren't for the good Senator Malkus, he would have lost his scholarship. Senator Malkus said, "We'll give you one more shot." And thankfully he did, because, at that time, my dad would have gone over, been a lieutenant, and the lifespan of lieutenants was pretty short in Korea.
Mm. Yeah.
And so, yeah.
So were you following his example, or you were just going your own path because I don't know what else to do?
Yeah, no, the Army generally follows the Marines, not the other way around.
Well, yes, I've heard. I know all about you, Marines. I got it. Yes.
But it's, just kind of a quick side note to give a little timestamp. My dad grew up on the Eastern Shore, and when he was going to Johns Hopkins, there was no Bay Bridge. And so he had to take a ferry across the bay to get to school. And occasionally, at the time, my granddad was the captain of the governor's yacht. And occasionally my granddad would bring the governor's yacht down to the Eastern Shore, and my dad would ride to school in the governor's yacht.
Excellent. Wow. I can't even, how long did that take? That must have been like hours.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, now with the Bay Bridge, from Cambridge.
It could still be hours.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well, so this is kind of in the area where I'm familiar with too. That's why we can talk about the Bay Bridge, and no, you don't want to be stuck there on a Friday afternoon in the summer.
No.
Or a Sunday evening, depending on which direction you're going. Yeah. So, okay. So you Marines, because you wanted the hardest test.
Yeah. I met with the Navy recruiter. He was a little fat and sloppy. I met with the Army recruiter. He was a little bit geeky. He looked like he, would lose a fight to some kid. And the Air Force recruiter never called me back. And I went to the Marine recruiter, and I was like, yeah, this is what I want to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you were there for 6 years?
6 years. Yep.
Did you get sent overseas? What did you do?
So I was deployed effectively twice. It was a reality. It was 3 total deployments, but the first time I was deployed to Philippines, but sub-deployed to to Japan, then sub-deployed to the Philippines. They were rebuilding the runway in Iwakuni, Japan, where I was really deployed to. And so we spent 5 months in the Philippines, came back to Iwakuni, Japan at the end of that deployment. And then I just transitioned over to the next deployment that was staying there. And I spent another 6 months in Japan, came back to the US for a year, and then went back over on another deployment. And at that time, a fellow named Saddam Hussein invaded a country called Kuwait. Mm-hmm. And they say, hey, guess what? Everybody's deployment's extended, so are your enlistments. And so I was over in Japan. I was in a very specialized part of the Marine Corps. It was a electronic warfare squadron. We were the only squadron in the Marine Corps that did what we did. And I basically knew everybody in the field. And they had set the other 2 detachments to the Gulf to fight the war. And I thought, yeah, they're not pulling them out of a war zone to come over and relieve us in Japan. I'm here for a long haul. And I really had no idea when I was coming back to the U.S., had no idea when I was getting out of the Marine Corps. And all of a sudden they activated a reserve squadron, and they said, hey, you guys are going home. I was like, great. I need to apply to go to college. And so I got an application to NC State, walked it down to a Japanese post office, and filed my application to go to NC State from Japan.
Okay. And that's what you did.
Went to NC State.
Got in. Spoiler alert, you got in, you graduated, and
liked it so much, went back for a graduate degree, and worked initially as a design engineer for 5 years, and discovered that's not a place that rewards creativity. I did great in my job, but I wasn't real happy because I wanted to be creative and create new and exciting things, which is why I went into engineering. Turns out that's not what they're looking for. So I went over into marketing and I marketed semiconductors for a decade, semiconductors for mobile phones. So my customers were, Nokia back in the day, Motorola back in the day, Ericsson back in the day, Samsung, Apple, uh, you know, Research in Motion. You remember when people had Blackberries?
Yes, I had one.
Yeah.
Crackberries. Mm-hmm.
So, but anyway, all those companies I've been, and many more, I've been in their offices, and it was great fun. The margins compressed. I mean, I knew it was going. We had to ride a 20% year-on-year downward price curve while still hitting our margin goals of 40 to 50% gross margins. And I was looking at that. I was like, yeah, the day is coming. They're going to ask me to fly coach to Asia. When that day comes, I'm done. And sure enough, it came, because I was going to Asia 4 or 5 times a year. And I was like, no, I'm not flying that miserable flight 4 or 5 times a year so somebody else can make millions of dollars.
Right. So so everything was fine until it wasn't fine in that situation.
Yeah.
And then once you got asked to fly coach, what is that, when you started your own gig?
That's when I started my own gig. Yep. And it's just helping other folks with their marketing. And it took me a while to figure out that, hey, I used to do super high trust, long sales cycle deals, with mobile phones, because when you make phones at the volumes that Apple or Nokia or one of those guys do, turns out they're real cautious on bringing on new suppliers and even new designs. And so I learned some things, and I realized, hey, my niche today is actually high ticket service businesses that have long sales cycles requiring a high level of trust. And if they're in a commoditized space, we really like it. So commoditized doesn't necessarily mean cheap. It just means there's hundreds or thousands of people that do what you do, and you look very, very similar. Well, guess what? In semiconductors, that was commoditized as well. So that really, all I had to do there prepared me for where I am today.
Yeah, that's an interesting transition, an interesting way to look at the similarities and how you got from there to where you are now.
Yeah. And it was funny. It didn't hit me immediately. And it was just one day I started asking me, I was like, where do I tend to do best? And it hit me. I was like, holy cow, it's the high trust, high ticket, long sales cycle, commoditized spaces.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your family life before we get into the real fine, not fine story, because it's relevant to that.
So my current family?
Your current family? How many families do you have?
Well, only one that I talk about.
I mean, you might. I don't know. You were in Japan deployed as a young man. I don't know what was happening. I've heard stories. I don't know.
Yeah, no. So I'm married to Karen. We've been married for 12 years. It's our second marriage.
Okay.
For both of us. And we both know each other's spouses. Well, know of. She hasn't. I've met her ex. She hasn't met my ex. But no, we've been married for 12 years, and and she has 2 kids, and so especially with one of them, just have a phenomenal relationship. He and his family are a couple hours away over in College Station. And in Texas terms, that's like next door.
Right. Yeah.
And we're actually in 2 weeks, we're going to see the other one. So looking forward to that. And so, yeah, that's kind of 7 grandkids, 8th one on the way.
Wow.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
That sounds fun, but it also now explains why she was so devoted, because it's not like you've been married for 40 years and she's like, oh yeah, I'm tired of him.
Yeah. Yeah. It's I mean, a little bit of a spoiler alert. She had the chance to pull the plug and didn't. And so I think there are days she questions that choice.
Yeah, I'm sure. Every woman would have those days. I can imagine. So we've teased this enough. I think that we can just jump into the story because it's very different than any of the stories I've ever had in the 160 plus episodes I've had on this show. And that's another reason why I was so excited to talk to you, because it's a it's an amazing, incredible story and tribute to your strength and determination. So let's jump into it and tell me what happened in September. It was September of 2021?
Started actually July 31st.
Okay.
So, the family had been in, and the ones that aren't a couple hours away, that they live in Tennessee, they had been staying with us, and we had been hiking in the nature preserve behind our house. We have hundreds of acres of preserve that go down the Lake Austin, and we'd been swimming in the lake, having a great time. And then the morning they're leaving was July 31st, 2021. And Karen and I both woke up just horribly sick, and sick in a way that we'd never been before. And we keep waking up sick. And this was weird because we're generally pretty healthy people. And we eventually realized we both had COVID, and we had it in a bad way.
Mm.
And I remember Sunday, just over a week and a day later, Karen started panicking. She said, "I'm having trouble breathing." And she jumped in the shower, and that opened up her lungs. And she said, "Will you go get me a pulse oximeter that measures your O2 levels?" And so I did, and come back, and she measures it, and it reads in the high 90s, which was great. That's where it should be. And she said, "Well, let's take a look at yours." And she put it on my finger, and it was in the mid 80s, which is not good.
Mm.
And she said, "This is not good." And I said, "Well, let's give it a day. Let's see what will happen." Because I was
were you having trouble? Yeah. Were you having trouble breathing, or you felt okay?
I felt okay. So that surprised me. And I thought, this will get better. And so the next morning, this was August 10th, 2021. I wake up a couple hours before her, and I wake up, and she has the pulse ox on her nightstand, and I measure my O2, and it's in the 70s. And I'm like, oh boy. And I just thought, she's going to make me go to the hospital, or at least go to the doctor.
Mm-hmm.
So I come downstairs, and I hadn't been working that much that prior week just because I'd been so sick. And I just sat down. I was a machine. I was catching up on everything because I knew pretty soon I wasn't going to be able to work. I'm sitting there knocking out some client work. And she comes downstairs, measures my oxygen. She's like, "You're going to the doctor." And so we make an appointment. Which the earliest we could get was in the afternoon, go over to the doctor. Most bizarre doctor visit ever. We go to the doctor because we're sick, and the doctor starts chastising us and saying, "Why didn't you go to the hospital?" "Look, we didn't know. We were sick. We came to you. Why are you jumping our case?" And we ended up sitting there like an hour, because at this time, all the hospitals were full, and they were going to see if they can find a hospital we could go to. And eventually they said, nobody has any capacity. So we went to one particular hospital, and Karen dropped me off at the front door. And by this point, I was having trouble breathing. Mm. And so I walk in the front door, go up to the desk, and it takes multiple breaths to say, "I'm having trouble breathing." I'm like, "I'm having trouble breathing." And they immediately pull me back, put oxygen on me, and pull me behind a curtain. And I hear Karen on the other side of the curtain saying, "Where's my husband? Where's my husband?" They're like, "Ma'am, you need to leave," because COVID, they weren't letting anybody in the hospital. And I didn't realize it at the time, but it would be another 2 months before I'd see her.
Mm.
I just didn't know. And she'd see me sooner, but I was out of it.
Yeah. And go on. So they took you back there, and then did lights out pretty soon, or what? Were you conscious for a while?
So this is funny. They were going to they get me back there, and they're like, "Hey, you know what? We think we're going to release you. We're going to send you home with oxygen." And so they have her wait in the car. This is August in Texas. My wife's waiting in the car in August in Texas. Yeah. And after a few hours, I realized, another incident happens, and my oxygen, I was stable for a little bit, and then my oxygen tanks again. And so I texted her. I said, you should just go home. I'm not sure what's going to happen. And then they say they're going to admit me. And so that was August 10th. And they get me up into a room that night, give me some horrible drug for some, well, not a strange reason. I think I know why, but a drug that had already been proven to not cure COVID and was known to cause kidney failure. They gave me that drug. It seems like the one redeeming trait of that drug was on August 10th, 2021, when they prescribed it to me. It was one of 3 drugs that was listed on CMS.gov, the government website, where the government would give the doctors a 20% bonus for prescribing that drug for COVID, despite the fact that they knew it was ineffective for COVID.
Awesome.
And that would put you in kidney failure too. And so I got admitted to a regular room, largely ignored. They didn't bathe me or anything, and so I'd have to ask my wife to send me some like baby wipes, and I would sit there and give myself my own baths because they were terrified to come into the room. And
they're terrified to come into the room, but COVID has already been a thing for a year and a half at this point.
Yeah,
like it wasn't. I don't want to say it wasn't as frightening, but like back when it first started, nobody knew anything about it. And so that was more terrifying. But now it's a year and a half later. So they should have had more knowledge and not been as afraid, maybe. I don't know, just jumping in.
There are a lot of things that should have happened differently. A lot of things. And the reality is some of those things, if they had happened differently, I would have never even been admitted to the hospital. Because there was a drug called monoclonal antibodies. It's truly a miracle drug. If you got monoclonal antibodies, your symptoms disappeared like that. And in some states like Florida, they had tents set up. And the state bought mass quantities of monoclonal antibodies. And they said, hey, if you have COVID, show up at one of these tents, you're going to get better. And that's one of the things that kept Florida's death rate so low. But it was a mystery. I'd never heard of those. So that's one thing that they should have done differently. The other thing, it turns out that drug they gave me the first day they admitted, that put me in kidney failure and on dialysis within 10 days of my final dose. And that drug killed a lot of people. So there's a lot of things they should have done differently. But I hung out in that room. I was able to keep my oxygen up for 11 days. I'd have to get in different positions, do different breathing exercises. But by 11 days in the hospital, I was 22 days into the infection. I just had to make it a few more days, and it was on the way leaving the system. And on the 11th day in the hospital, they decided to shoot me full of morphine, which suppresses respiration, and it made me quit fighting. And so they called my wife in the middle of the night, woke her up, and basically bullied her into putting me on the ventilator. Instead of saying, hey, you know what? We shot him up with morphine. Maybe we should turn him on his stomach and help him with breathing until the morphine wears off. Which, by the way,
why did they shoot you up with? Were you in pain?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. No, it's a very good question.
I just ask the obvious questions. That's all.
Yeah. It was funny. About a year later, I was having surgery to reconstruct my mouth because they goobered that up when they put me on the ventilator. Okay. And when I was waking up from surgery, Karen had to keep shaking me. She's like, Craig, wake up, breathe. And it turns out that's one of the effects of anesthesia is you just stop breathing or your respiration drops. And she's watching my O2 and seeing it drop. And so I asked the nurse, I said, hey, would morphine do the same thing? She's like, oh, yeah, absolutely. Because morphine suppresses respiration, which is a weird thing to give somebody with a respiratory issue.
Yes. Okay. So they gave you morphine and put you on a respirator because your oxygen levels were dropping. And then
and that was lights out.
That was lights out. For how long?
6 weeks.
And she was allowed to come in now, right?
Not initially. There was a little bit of contention, a little back and forth. They finally relented and said, all right, you can come in for an hour a day. And one of the days she was coming in, they almost arrested her. Um, yeah, and she was seriously, she was almost arrested for coming to visit, even though they granted permission. And um,
Wow.
so she would come in, and for an hour a day, she'd sing to me and she'd pray over me and she'd say words of encouragement. And the wild thing is, I heard some of the things she said.
Hmm.
I think I heard a lot of
And
the
you
things she
remember
said.
them.
Yeah, I remember a few. I think I heard a lot more.
Mhm.
And, but the, um, but yeah, it was. So my time in the coma, and this is really hard to describe. Let me see if I can make this simple. I describe my time in the coma as a series of dreams, but
Yeah.
dreams is an imperfect word. It was more like a place that I resided halfway between consciousness and the darkness. And
Mhm.
so things that happen in the real world entered my dreams, but through a very distorted lens.
Mhm.
And so I've been able to go through her journal and say, oh, like for instance, September 20th, I asked her, I said, what side of the bed were you on? And she said, well, normally I would visit you on your left at this phase. And I was like, but on this day, what side? She said, oh, I came in on your right. And in my world, in my world, I knew I had been sick. I was at a weird medical commune in West Virginia, Harper's Ferry, and I, the commune was the medical facility was in a Victorian house with lacy white curtains and yellow tinted lights. And they'd been treating me harshly, and they'd put a willow reed down my throat. It was very uncomfortable and it kept me from talking, but they said it was going to make me better.
Mm.
And I was on a gurney, and Karen came in on my right, and I looked at her and I said, you've got to get me out of here. What's happening here is not good. So what was happening in the real world, I was in the hospital. They had me sitting up, and she was surprised to see me sitting up. And so she came in on my right. At the time, I had a trach, which was representative of the willow reed,
Mhm.
and it was uncomfortable and it was supposed to make me better, but it kept me from talking. They had been handling me roughly. It turns out before Karen's visit, they had been doing PT with me, which was just moving my legs and what have
Mhm.
you, because I was a rag doll at best at that time. I was clinically anorexic and fully atrophied. I couldn't lift an arm or a leg.
Wow.
But what's really interesting, so you see how that was reality, but through a very, very distorted lens.
Yeah.
Here's where it gets wilder. My dream ended when she showed up. As a matter of fact, she's in very, very few of my dreams. And when she shows up in the dreams, it's just for a moment, and then that's the end. It turns out the brain is between 2 and 4% of your body mass,
Mhm.
but it consumes between 20 and 25% of your energy. The brain consumes a ton of energy.
Yeah.
My best read on what was happening was when she showed up, I knew I was safe. And my brain said, okay, we're going to shut down and save a little bit of energy.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. And as you were telling that story of where you thought you were in Harper's Ferry in this Victorian house, I was starting to think like, was there an element of some other life, like a past life or something? It's like combining in. I know it's so random, but
No, well, my brother lived in Harper's Ferry. He still has a house in Harper's Ferry.
okay. All right.
So I was familiar with the area, and I went back there earlier this year, and there's an area in Harper's Ferry they call Up on the Mountain. It's
Yeah.
actually Shannondale. Okay, you know it. And so as we were going up there, I saw a house, and it reminded me of a different dream, and which was kind of an unsettling. It's one of what I call three death dreams. People died around me in my dreams, and the number of the people that died in my dreams kind of matches the number of people that died around me in the hospital.
Yeah.
And but I looked in this one yard and I was like, holy crap, that's from my dream. Now I'd only been up on the mountain once before, but it wasn't exact, but it just reminded me of that dream.
Yeah.
And so in a lot of dreams, there, like I said, there were bits of reality, there were bits that weren't. I'd been recalled to the Marine Corps in my dreams, not active duty, but more as an advisor. And they were asking my advice on whether to bomb some village or not. And, um, and, it turns out there were some key events that happened. There were the 13 military folks that died from the suicide bomber in Afghanistan. That happened during one of my dreams. I'm trying to remember where I was that day. I think I was in surgery. I think I was having a feeding tube. I had a feeding tube taken out of my nose and put in my stomach. And then I know I was in surgery on September 11th, 2021. That was when I was having my trach put in. And that was the day that we pulled out of Afghanistan. And so weirdly in my dreams, I'm called back to the Marine Corps. I'm in an advisory role in a number of things. And I was asked to falsify government documents twice in my dreams.
Okay.
Which kind of makes me wonder what was happening in my room at that time.
Yeah. Yeah. All of this is so fascinating to me because it's kind of proof that this belief that we live that we live our lives through our conscious mind is not true. I mean, yes, we live through conscious mind, but so much more is through the other than conscious mind.
Yeah.
And how much it's picking up even when you're not aware of it, consciously aware.
Yeah. No, it was wild. So here's an example. One of the things that I repeated back to Karen. So again, I knew I was sick in my dreams. But I didn't fully understand that I had a trach, and those things. And in one dream, I actually spent a lot of time in Louisiana in my dreams, which I don't know why Louisiana. I don't go there. I drive through Louisiana, not to Louisiana. And but in this dream, I'd been sent to a resort in Louisiana to convalesce. And this resort had an interesting room service menu that had some interesting choices. And my favorite choice on the room service menu was I could request a young lady come into the room and she would spray raw cow's milk at my face.
Okay.
And it would make me feel better. And so I just sat there and I kept hitting redial, bring me some more of that raw cow's milk. And one time they came in, they misunderstood my request and were about to offer a more, let's say, traditional service. And I was like, no, I just want the cow's milk. And then eventually they said, they came in on the speaker in the room. They said, Mr. Andrews, it's time for you to leave. And I said, I can't move. So I'm aware that I can't move. My body had fully atrophied. And they're like, well, we don't care. You need to leave. I'm like, I can't move. You're going to have to come in and get me. And they start getting angrier and angrier. And they say, look, if you don't leave, we're going to tell your wife about your room service. And I said, you can tell her she knows I like raw cow's milk. There's no secrets there. And at one point I tried to roll out of bed. I figured if I fell on the floor, somebody would have to come in and pick me up. And I heard them mumbling and they said, let's get his wife. And Karen came in and she put her hand on my left shoulder. Remember, left and right, it's important. I remember the difference. And she said, Craig, this is Karen. I'm your wife. It's going to be okay. And when I told Karen that story, she said, Craig, I used to say that to you when you were in the ICU on the ventilator. And so that's an example of how it entered in. Now, it turns out at one phase, respiratory techs would come in my room, usually young ladies, and they would put a mask of nebulized albuterol on my face.
Okay.
And it would make me feel better.
Yeah. Okay.
My brain just interpreted that as raw cow's milk.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. It's also interesting. And again, this has been proven in so many studies that even people who are dying the last sense that goes is hearing. They hear everything that's being said. Why it's so important to pay attention to what you're saying in front of somebody who is unresponsive, technically unresponsive, because you're still hearing everything.
Yeah. And I heard some things people shouldn't have said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And then, so once you came out of the coma, like, how did you get so, what's the word? Like you were, like you said, you had no muscle tone, couldn't move at all. Like, how did that happen so fast? I mean, 6 weeks doesn't seem like really long enough for everything to atrophy.
Yeah, it turns out the movies lie. It's like Steven Seagal when he wakes up from his 3-year coma and he's kicking butt in 2 days. Yeah, it doesn't work that way. The body deteriorates quickly in those conditions.
Mm.
And I could show you pictures if I haven't shown you already. I mean, my right arm today is about the size of my legs then.
Yeah.
And
You
I
showed me
just had,
the one picture of you when you were first starting to work out again, when you were still
yeah,
in the wheelchair.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It just, one, they weren't feeding me enough. That's a
Mm.
different story where, in my dreams, I was negotiating for food. And in the real world, nurse came in and asked me if I needed anything. Of course, she's asking somebody with a trach that can't talk. My face is sunken in at that point. And I said, I mouthed food. And she laughs and she says, oh, we can't get you food. And she leaves the room. And fortunately, my wife was sitting there. And I shook my head and I said, I'm starving. And that's one of those moments, seriously, I don't know if I would be here today if my wife hadn't heard me, because I had no reserves. I didn't have anything else I could lose.
Right. And how is your body going to heal when it has no fuel?
Right.
So I don't know what question to ask you next, but was there a lawsuit?
uh, no.
Okay.
We passed something called the CARES Act, and it had, like most things that go through Congress, it has like this big concept, this big purpose. And then when you dig down, there's all sorts of things buried in it. And one of the things that was buried in the CARES Act was broad sweeping immunity for the doctors.
Mm.
Basically, they had free reign to do whatever they wanted, and they could never be prosecuted.
Mm.
And for example, that drug they gave me that put me in kidney failure,
Mm-hmm.
that drug killed a lot of people. It wasn't a new drug. They weren't oblivious to this fact. The drug had
Mm-hmm.
been around for 11 years, 12 years when they prescribed it to me. In 2015, they repurposed it for Ebola. 53% of the people they gave that drug to for Ebola died.
Mm.
It's a very lethal drug. And 10 months before they gave it to me, the World Health Organization put out a policy saying, don't prescribe remdesivir for the treatment of COVID. It doesn't work. So for months, they had known it was ineffective for COVID. For years, they had known that it would wreck your kidneys. And they gave me that drug. Somebody should be in jail, but we gave them broad sweeping immunity.
Okay. Why do you think you are still here when so many people died and it seems like you were very close to it?
Very close. Very close. I think at a high level, what I tell people is it's like God grabbed me by the back of the shirt and yanked me off the ledge.
Mm.
So you're going to hang out for a few more years.
Mm-hmm.
And fundamentally, I believe that's it. That creates complications because I know there are many people of faith that were praying. As a matter of fact, the daughter of a lifetime mentor, she died on the ventilator 4 days before they put me on the ventilator. And so for me, it's just one of those questions in life. Why did I live and she died? Why did so many others die? I don't know. But I know this, I should be dead. There, almost everybody that went on the ventilator with the Delta variant of COVID, I mean, overwhelmingly, everybody died.
Mm-hmm.
It's the rare exception of those that lived.
Yeah. And I wasn't asking you to justify why you're still
Yeah.
here and everybody isn't. Okay, just making clear.
Well,
I
it's,
didn't know if you
no.
felt like you had some, you know, over some purpose that has been showed to you since then of like, oh, this is why I'm still here. And maybe you'll never know, but I just thought maybe you did know.
Yeah, and something anybody that went through what I went through wrestles with is survivor's guilt. That's a
Mm-hmm.
reality. So that's always there. I think that's the undercurrent that you heard. But yeah, no, I believe God wants me here. Not that, and I'm just cautiously saying it's not that I think He hates the people that
Right.
that
Yeah.
didn't make it.
It was their time and it wasn't your time yet.
Yeah,
There's
and
still
it's
more
just
for
one of
you to
those
do.
weird mysteries in life,
Mhm.
and so for me, there's some things, look back and some things I assessed. I'm happy I was doing. I'm doing more of that. But there are other things. It's it changed my relationship with my wife,
Mhm.
and it's you look at some of the stupid stuff you argue over when you're married, and then you go through something like that, and you're like, yeah, other stuff that's really stupid that we
Yeah.
argued over
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Right. Right. Um, I had
But
mentioned. Go ahead.
but I will say this: one thing that's become a little bit of a mission of mine is to speak for those who didn't make it, and to say they were done wrong, and to speak to those who survived. There's so many people wrestling with guilt over choices they made for their loved ones.
Hmm.
And the message that I have for them is the deck was stacked against you in ways that you don't understand.
Hmm.
And you did, like Karen, their choices, if we could have a redo, we both agree, hey, what that night they made the phone call, she would have made different choices that night. We agree on that. But you don't know until you're in that position. So for those that are
Right.
wrestling with that, you made the best choice with the information you had. You got to forgive
Yeah.
yourself.
Hmm. I would see that as true in every case, whether it's related to situations like you were in terms of health or anything. Like we're always making the best choices that we can in that moment with the information that we have, with the decision making abilities, with whatever. It's always the best choice in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And, for at least a year and a half, Karen just kept beating herself up,
Mm.
especially when she saw me struggling. I mean, people see me today and they just have trouble picturing the guy who shriveled up guy in a wheelchair that was trying to learn how to walk again.
Yeah.
And she'd beat herself up. And I was like, Karen, you got to stop it. Um, you know, you
Hmm.
made the best choice you could in a pressure situation with the information you had. And nobody can judge you for that until they're sitting in the same shoes.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to tie back to something that we said near the beginning when we were talking about your Marine Corps experience, which was, and I want to ask the question of, do you think that helped you survive your training?
Yeah. You know, the
And I ask
Marines,
that because in one of my previous episodes with Leland Holgate Sr., and we talked about his accident when he became quadriplegic and he healed from that. Part of his military training was what kicked in to help him go, oh no, this is not how I'm leaving.
yeah. Yeah. So when I was in my coma, I was fighting during those dreams. I was fighting, and there's, I could tell you the dreams. I still remember my dreams from 3 years ago, the same way that you remember reality
Mhm.
from 3 years ago.
Yeah, well, and
I
they're
could,
in your book, right?
yes, some of them are in the book. Um, but in my dreams, it was just constantly fighting. I was stuck and I was working to get unstuck. But then once I woke up and the hard path recovery began, it's tough. And I'll just be honest, I marvel at those that go through recovery and rehab without the training that I had. And
Hmm.
it's, the Marines, more than making people that are physically strong, the Marines builds people that are mentally strong. And that's really what you need when your legs, you have these little bird legs. You don't have the physical strength. You need the mental strength to push when you have almost nothing to give. And and so, one thing that surprises people is about 2.5 months out of the hospital, I was still in a wheelchair, and I couldn't get an occupational therapist out to my house. They just wouldn't visit, my part of town. Not that it's a bad part of town; it's just they don't come out here. And so I thought I saw an advertisement for something called Camp Gladiator, where they had free workouts on Saturdays, and I thought, well, I'll go to that, and I'll get my training there. I'll get my strength building there. And so I went to Camp Gladiator and started working out on Saturdays when I was in a wheelchair and still on oxygen. So, okay.